I've always believed that love should be enough, that if you give everything you have to someone, they'll value it. They'll see the sacrifice and honor it. But as I sit here in my small apartment, staring at the phone that never rings anymore, I realize how naive I was. My name is Sylvia, and I'm 55 years old. For 32 years, I've been a mother. For 32 years, that's been my entire identity. I worked double shifts at the diner so Michael could have the designer sneakers the other kids wore. I skipped my own birthday celebrations to save money for his college fund. I turned down dates, ignored my own dreams, and made every single decision based on one question: what's best for my son? If you enjoy emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And please comment which city you're watching from. Yesterday morning started like any other. Coffee at 6, checking my phone for messages that rarely come. Getting ready for another shift at the diner where I've worked for 15 years. The same routine I've followed since Michael moved out 3 years ago to find himself in the city. He said he needed space, needed to build his career, needed to become the man he was meant to be. I understood. I supported him. I always have. But then I saw it. A simple notification on Facebook that shattered my world into pieces I'm still trying to put back together. Michael Patterson and Jessica White are now married. The words blurred on my screen as I read them again. And again. Married. My son. My only child. The boy I carried for 9 months. Raised alone after his father walked out when things got difficult. The young man I put through college while working 60-hour weeks and living on crackers and coffee because his textbooks cost more than my grocery budget. Married, without telling his mother. I scrolled through the comments, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. Congratulations from friends I'd never heard him mention. Photos from cousins who apparently knew about this wedding before I did. Heart emojis and celebration gifts from people who were invited to the most important day of my son's life, while I wasn't even told it was happening. There were photos, beautiful photos of Michael in a black tuxedo, looking handsome and confident in a way that made my heart swell with pride even as it broke. Jessica in an elegant white dress, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her smile radiant as she looked up at the son I raised to be a good man. The venue looked expensive, more expensive than anything I could have contributed to, which maybe explained why I wasn't included. But that wasn't what hurt the most. What hurt was seeing my cousin Martha in the background of one photo, dressed in what looked like a new outfit, holding a champagne glass and laughing. Martha, who I'd helped financially when her husband lost his job 2 years ago. Martha, who knew exactly how much Michael meant to me because she'd listened to me worry about him through countless phone calls. She knew. They all knew, and no one thought to tell me. I called Michael immediately, my heart pounding as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. When he finally answered, his voice was casual, almost cheerful. "Hey, Mom. What's up?" "Michael," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just saw on Facebook that you got married. Is that true?" There was a pause. A long, terrible pause that told me everything I needed to know before he said a word. "Oh, that. Yeah, it was just a small thing, Mom. Really informal. Jessica's family wanted something simple. Simple." The photos showed at least 50 people, professional flowers, a 3-tier cake, and what looked like a beautiful reception hall. But to my son, it was simple. Because it was simple to exclude the woman who had sacrificed everything to make his life possible. "I would have loved to be there," I said quietly. "I would have loved to meet Jessica properly, to see you get married. I know, Mom, but it was really last minute. Jessica's dad had to travel for work, and it all came together quickly. I was going to call you after, not before, not to invite me, not to include me in planning the most important day of his life. After, like an afterthought. Like someone you notify about something that's already over and can't be changed." "I see," I managed to say. "Well, congratulations. I'm happy for you." "Thanks, Mom. Listen, I've got to run. Jessica and I are heading out for our honeymoon. I'll call you when we get back, okay?" He hung up before I could ask where they were going, before I could ask when they'd be back. Before I could ask any of the 1,000 questions a mother should be able to ask about her son's wedding and his new wife and his new life, that apparently didn't have room for the woman who had made it all possible. I sat in my kitchen for an hour after that call, staring at the refrigerator where I still had photos of Michael from high school graduation, from college, from the last time he visited me 6 months ago. He'd seemed distant then, checking his phone constantly, talking about Jessica and how sophisticated she was, how different she was from the girls he'd dated before, how much her family had welcomed him, how successful her father was, how they were helping him network in his career. I should have seen it then. The way he talked about them like they were the family he'd always wanted. The way he never mentioned bringing Jessica to meet me, never suggested we all have dinner together, never seemed to think I might want to be part of this important relationship in his life. I raised him to be ambitious, to want better for himself than what we had when he was growing up. I encouraged him to reach for opportunities I never had, to build the kind of life I could only dream about, but I never imagined that reaching higher would mean leaving me behind completely. I never thought that my love, my sacrifice, my entire life's work would become something he was embarrassed by. The silence in my apartment feels different now. Before, it was just quiet. Now, it's empty. It's the sound of a mother who has been erased from her son's story, written out of the most important chapters like she never existed at all. I've always believed that love should be enough, but sitting here, looking at wedding photos of my son on a computer screen instead of being there to witness his happiness in person, I'm starting to understand that sometimes love isn't enough at all. The days after discovering Michael's wedding felt like walking through fog. I kept hoping he would call, maybe explain things better, maybe invite me to meet Jessica properly now that the stress of wedding planning was over. Instead, I got silence. Complete, deafening silence. A week later, my phone finally rang. It was Martha. "Sylvia, honey," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news wrapped in false concern. "I've been meaning to call you." "Have you?" I asked, remembering her face in those wedding photos, her champagne glass, her laughter. "That's interesting timing. Now, don't be like that. I know you're upset about the wedding, but you have to understand Michael's position. Jessica's family is they're particular about things. They have certain standards." Standards. The word hit me like a slap. "What kind of standards, Martha?" "Oh, they're educated people, successful. Jessica's father owns 3 car dealerships, and her mother is very involved in the country club. They've welcomed Michael into their circle, and he's doing so well now. His new job at Jessica's father's company is a real opportunity for him." I listened to Martha explain how wonderful Jessica's family was, how they'd taken Michael under their wing, how much they'd helped him advance his career. Every word felt like another nail in a coffin I was just beginning to realize had been built for me long before this wedding happened. "But what does that have to do with not inviting his mother to his wedding?" I asked. Martha's pause told me everything. "Sylvia, darling, I think you need to understand that Michael is trying to build something here. Something important. And sometimes our backgrounds can be limiting. Jessica's family is used to a certain lifestyle, and they might not understand." "Understand what, Martha? That I worked myself to the bone to give my son every opportunity? That I sacrificed everything so he could have the education and chances they take for granted?" "That's not what I meant," Martha said, but her voice had grown cooler. "I just think maybe it's time you accepted that Michael has outgrown his old life. It doesn't mean he doesn't love you. It just means he's moving in a different direction. Outgrown his old life. Outgrown me. The woman who had been his everything for 32 years had become something to outgrow, like clothes that no longer fit or toys he'd moved beyond." After I hung up, I sat staring at my hands. These hands that had worked double shifts, that had packed his lunches every school day for 12 years, that had applauded at every baseball game and graduation ceremony. These hands that had signed loan papers and wrote checks and counted out tips from the diner jar to make sure he had spending money for college. When had I become someone to be ashamed of? 2 weeks later, I received a text message from Michael. Not a call, a text. "Mom, Jessica and I are back from our honeymoon. We'd like to have you over for dinner Sunday. 6 p.m. Address attached." I stared at that message for 20 minutes. The tone was formal, like an appointment reminder. No warmth, no enthusiasm, no "can't wait for you to meet my wife," or "excited to show you our new place." Just the bare facts: time, date, location. But still, I felt a spark of hope. Maybe this was his way of making things right. Maybe Jessica wanted to meet me, and he was just nervous about how we'd get along. Maybe I was reading too much into everything, letting my hurt feelings make me paranoid. I spent the entire week planning what to wear, what to bring. I bought a nice bottle of wine I couldn't really afford, and a beautiful bouquet of flowers. I practiced conversations in my head, thought of questions to ask Jessica that would show I was interested in her life, in their life together. Their apartment was in a part of town I rarely visited. All glass and steel buildings with names like the Metropolitan and Heritage Square. The kind of places I'd driven past for years while going to work, wondering what it would be like to live somewhere so elegant. When I knocked on their door, Michael answered wearing clothes I'd never seen before. Expensive clothes. His hair was styled differently, more polished. Even his smile looked different. More careful, more controlled. "Mom," he said, giving me a quick, awkward hug. "Come in." The apartment was beautiful. Spotless. Everything looked like it had come from a catalog. Perfectly coordinated and clearly expensive. I felt suddenly conscious of my department store dress and my practical shoes. The flowers from the grocery store that had seemed nice when I bought them, but now looked cheap in this pristine environment. Jessica appeared from what I assumed was the kitchen, and my breath caught. She was even more beautiful in person than in the wedding photos. Tall, blonde, with the kind of effortless elegance that comes from never having to worry about money. Her smile was polite but distant, like she was greeting a service worker. "You must be Sylvia," she said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "I'm Jessica. Welcome to our home. Our home. Not their first apartment together, not their new place, but our home, like they'd been established for years, and I was the outsider being granted temporary admission. "These are for you," I said, offering the flowers and wine. "Congratulations on your marriage. I'm so sorry I missed the wedding." "Oh, how thoughtful," Jessica said, taking them with the kind of smile people use for gifts they don't want. "Michael, could you put these in water?" The dinner was excruciating. Every attempt I made at conversation felt wrong, unwelcome. When I asked about their honeymoon, Jessica answered with polite but minimal details. When I asked about Michael's new job, he spoke mostly to Jessica, like she was the only one in the room whose opinion mattered. I tried asking about their apartment, complimenting the decor, showing interest in their new life. Jessica answered with the distant courtesy you'd show a stranger, while Michael nodded along like he was watching our interaction from outside himself. "This is such a beautiful neighborhood," I said, looking out their window at the city lights. "Michael, do you remember when you were little? How we used to drive through areas like this and you'd say you were going to live somewhere fancy someday?" "Did he really?" Jessica asked, and something in her tone made me look at her more carefully. There was amusement there, but not the warm kind. "How quaint." Michael's face reddened slightly. "I was just a kid, Mom. Kids say all kinds of things." "You weren't just saying things," I protested gently. "You were determined. You worked so hard in school, so focused on your goals. I was so proud of your ambition." "Well," Jessica said, settling back in her chair with her wine glass, "Michael's told me so much about his humble beginnings. It's quite a success story, really. From where he started to where he is now." The words were technically complimentary, but they felt like ice water. Where he started. Like his childhood. Like me. Like the life we'd built together was something unfortunate he'd had to overcome rather than the foundation that had made everything else possible. I looked at Michael, waiting for him to say something, to correct her implication, to defend the life we'd shared. Instead, he looked uncomfortable, like he wanted the conversation to move on to safer topics. "I've always been proud of how hard Michael worked," I said quietly. "We didn't have much, but we had each other. And look how wonderfully everything turned out." "Yes," Jessica agreed, her smile sharp as crystal. "It's amazing what the right opportunities can do for a person. Michael's been such a quick learner since he joined Daddy's company. It's like he was meant for this lifestyle, as opposed to the lifestyle he'd lived before, as opposed to the lifestyle I'd provided, as opposed to me. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation that felt like walking through a minefield. Every story I started to tell about Michael's childhood was met with subtle redirections. Every attempt to connect was deflected with cool professionalism. When I finally left, Michael walked me to the elevator. For a moment, I thought he might say something real, something that acknowledged the strangeness of the evening, the distance that seemed to have opened between us. Instead, he said, "Thanks for coming, Mom. Jessica was nervous about meeting you, but I think it went well." "Did it?" I asked. "Because it felt like she thinks I'm someone you need to be rescued from." "That's not true," he said, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. She's different from what you're used to. Her family has certain ways of doing things. I'm still learning too." "Learning what, Michael? How to be ashamed of where you came from?" The elevator doors opened and he actually looked relieved. "I'll call you soon, Mom. Drive safe." As those doors closed between us, I saw my reflection in the polished metal. A 55-year-old woman in a department store dress, holding an empty wine glass because I'd drunk more than I should have just to get through the evening. A woman who had just been introduced to her son's new life and found no place for herself in it. The drive home felt endless. Every red light gave me more time to replay the evening, to examine every subtle slight, every careful word that had been chosen to make me understand my new position in Michael's world. I wasn't his beloved mother anymore. I was his past, his before, his humble beginnings that needed to be managed and contained so they wouldn't interfere with his after. The weeks that followed that dinner became a masterclass in how to make someone feel invisible while they're still breathing. Michael's calls became less frequent, and when they did come, they felt scripted, like items being checked off a list. "How are you doing, Mom? Everything okay?" "Good. I'm really busy with work, but I'll call you soon." Soon never came when I expected it, and when it did, it was always brief, always surface level, always with the unspoken understanding that deeper conversations were no longer welcome. I started paying attention to his social media in ways I never had before. It felt like spying on my own son's life, but it was the only way to know what was happening with him. Photos of dinner parties I wasn't invited to, weekend trips to places I'd never been, professional events where he wore suits that cost more than my monthly rent. In every photo, he looked happy, confident, like he'd found exactly where he belonged. And in none of them was there any trace of the life we'd shared together. Jessica's social media was even more revealing. She posted constantly about their activities, their friends, their sophisticated lifestyle. She shared photos of elaborate dinner parties at her parents' house, charity events they attended, couples' vacations with other young professionals. Her captions were filled with gratitude for her amazing husband and their blessed life. But what struck me most was how she wrote about Michael. In her posts, he wasn't someone who had worked his way up from modest circumstances. He wasn't someone who had overcome challenges to achieve success. He was simply someone who belonged in her world, as if he'd always been there, as if his life had started the day he met her. She never mentioned his family, never acknowledged that he had a mother who loved him. In Jessica's version of their story, Michael had appeared fully formed, already perfect for the life she wanted to live. 3 months after that dinner, I decided to make one more attempt to be part of their lives. Michael had mentioned that Jessica was planning a housewarming party for their new apartment. They'd moved to an even more expensive building downtown. I thought maybe if I offered to help, to contribute something, they might include me. I called Michael on a Tuesday evening, catching him at home. "Mom, hi. What's up? I was thinking about the housewarming party you mentioned. I'd love to help with something. I could make my chocolate cake. You know, the one you always loved. Or I could help with decorations or—" "Oh, Mom, that's really sweet, but we've got everything handled. Jessica's mother is coordinating with the caterers, and her friends are helping with decorations. It's going to be pretty fancy." Pretty fancy. Translation: not appropriate for someone like me. "I see," I said, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. "Well, I'd still love to come. Just to see your new place, meet some of your friends." The pause that followed was so long, I thought the call had dropped. "The thing is, Mom, it's mostly going to be people from work and Jessica's social circle. Her parents' friends, college friends, that crowd. You probably wouldn't know anyone there. That's okay, I said. I'd like to meet your friends. I'd like to see this new life you're building. I know, but he sighed, and I could hear Jessica's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. Look, Mom, this isn't really your kind of thing. These people are... It's a different world. You'd probably be uncomfortable. Let me decide what makes me uncomfortable, Michael. Mom, please don't make this difficult. Maybe we can have dinner again soon, just the three of us. But this party, it's important for my career, for our future. I need everything to go smoothly. And there it was. The truth finally spoken out loud. I was a complication, a potential embarrassment. Someone who might not go smoothly with his important new life. I understand, I said quietly. I wouldn't want to jeopardize your future. It's not like that, Mom. You're being dramatic. Dramatic. For wanting to be included in my son's life. For wanting to meet his friends. For wanting to celebrate his success instead of being hidden from it. 2 weeks later, I saw the photos from the party on Jessica's Instagram. Dozens of beautiful people in beautiful clothes, holding beautiful drinks in their beautiful apartment. Everyone looked like they belonged in a magazine spread about successful young couples and their glamorous social circles. I studied every face in those photos, looking for someone who looked like me. Someone who seemed a little out of place, a little less polished, a little more real. But everyone fit perfectly into Jessica's curated world. Everyone except the one person who had sacrificed everything to help Michael reach this level of success. The comments on Jessica's photos were what finally broke something inside me. Friends congratulating them on their beautiful home, their beautiful life, their beautiful future. Someone wrote, "You two are literally perfect together." Another said, "Living the dream. So happy for you both." But the comment that made my hands shake was from Jessica's mother. "So proud of you both for building this wonderful life together. Michael fits into our family like he was always meant to be here. Like he was always meant to be here. Like his first 32 years of life, the years I had poured my entire existence into, had been just a waiting period until he found his real family. I started avoiding places where I might run into people who knew about Michael's new life. The grocery store where Martha shopped. The church where my cousin Beth attended and had probably seen the wedding photos. The diner where I worked, because some of the regular customers knew Michael and might ask how he was doing. How could I explain that my son was doing wonderfully, but that his success had somehow required erasing me from his story? At work, I became the woman who didn't talk about her family anymore. When coworkers asked about Michael, I gave brief, non-committal answers. He's doing well, living in the city now, very busy with work. I stopped showing the photos I used to carry in my wallet. I stopped mentioning the pride I felt in his accomplishments, because that pride had become complicated by the understanding that those accomplishments seemed to require my absence. Mrs. Henderson, one of the regular customers at the diner, noticed the change. She was an elderly woman who came in every Tuesday for coffee and pie, always sitting at the same corner booth, always asking about my family with genuine interest. "You haven't mentioned Michael in a while," she said one afternoon. "How's that boy of yours doing?" "He's fine," I said, refilling her coffee cup. "Married now, living downtown." "Married? How wonderful! When do I get to meet this daughter-in-law of yours?" I stared at the coffee pot in my hands, unable to answer. How do you explain to a sweet old lady that your daughter-in-law considers you an embarrassment? That your son thinks introducing you to his new wife's social circle might damage his career prospects? "We're still getting acquainted," I finally managed. Mrs. Henderson studied my face with the sharp perception that comes with age and experience. "Sylvia, honey, are you all right? You look like someone who's carrying a heavy burden." And suddenly, standing there in the familiar environment of the diner where I'd worked for 15 years, wearing the uniform that smelled like coffee and fried food, talking to a customer who had watched me worry about Michael through high school and college and his early career struggles, I felt the full weight of what I'd lost. It wasn't just that Michael had gotten married without telling me. It wasn't just that his new wife looked down on me. It wasn't even that they'd excluded me from their social circle and their celebration. It was that I had become someone my own son was ashamed to acknowledge. The love I had given him, The sacrifices I had made, the foundation I had provided for his success, all of it had been reframed as something he needed to overcome rather than something to be grateful for. I had spent 32 years building a relationship with someone who had decided I was no longer worth the effort it would take to include me in his life. I had been replaced by people who could offer him things I never could: money, status, connections, a version of himself that didn't include memories of secondhand clothes and government assistance, and a mother who worked multiple jobs just to keep the lights on. "I'm fine, Mrs. Henderson," I said, forcing the smile that had become my default expression when people asked about things I couldn't explain. "Just tired. It's been a long day." But as I walked away from her table, I caught my reflection in the diner's front window, a 55-year-old woman in a uniform that had seen better days, serving coffee to customers who treated her with more respect and kindness than her own son did. That night, I sat in my apartment and did something I'd never done before. I wrote down everything I could remember about raising Michael. Every sacrifice, every double shift, every time I'd gone without so he could have what he needed, every dream of my own I'd deferred so his could come true. The list filled 3 pages, single-spaced. And when I finished writing, I realized something that made my chest feel hollow. If someone else had written this list about their child, I would have called it love. I would have called it devotion. I would have called it the most beautiful example of maternal sacrifice I'd ever seen. But apparently, if you were the child who received all that love, all that sacrifice, all that devotion, you could call it something else entirely. You could call it an embarrassment. You could call it your humble beginnings. You could call it something you needed to outgrow. You could call it something that didn't fit into your new life. 6 months passed without a single phone call from Michael. 6 months of checking my phone every morning, hoping to see his name on the screen. 6 months of watching other customers at the diner show off photos of their grandchildren while I had nothing to share about my own son's life. Christmas approached like a storm I could see coming but couldn't avoid. For 32 years, Christmas had meant Michael coming home. It meant his favorite cookies, his stocking hung on my mantel, his presence filling my small apartment with the kind of joy that made all the hard years worth it. I waited until December 15th before I called him, hoping he might invite me to celebrate with them, or at least tell me he was coming home for a visit. "Michael," I said when he answered. "I was wondering about Christmas plans. I know you and Jessica probably have things with her family, but I thought maybe—" "Actually, Mom, we're going to Aspen. Jessica's parents have a cabin there and it's become a family tradition. Her whole extended family goes. It's going to be really special. Family tradition. Her family tradition. The family he apparently now belonged to completely." "I see," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "What about Christmas Eve? Could we maybe have dinner before you leave? We're flying out on the 23rd. Things are really crazy with packing and work deadlines. Maybe when we get back?" Maybe. The word that had become his standard response to every invitation, every request for time, every attempt I made to remain part of his life. "Of course," I said. "Have a wonderful time." I spent Christmas Day alone for the first time in 32 years. I didn't put up a tree. What was the point? I didn't hang stockings or make cookies or play Christmas music. Instead, I worked a double shift at the diner, serving Christmas dinner to other people who had families to go home to afterward. The loneliness was crushing, but what was worse was seeing Jessica's Instagram posts from Aspen, photo after photo of Michael with her family, building snowmen with her nephews, sitting around a massive Christmas tree in a living room that looked like something from a magazine. He looked so happy, so comfortable, so perfectly integrated into their world. In one photo, Jessica's father had his arm around Michael's shoulders. The caption read, "So grateful for our son-in-law. He fits right in with the family tradition." Son-in-law, not Michael Patterson, not the boy who'd been raised by a single mother who worked herself to exhaustion. Just son-in-law, like he'd been born into their family. I stared at that photo for a long time, studying Michael's face. He was smiling the way I remembered from his childhood, before life got complicated, before responsibilities and money worries cast shadows over our small celebrations. He looked free. He looked like he belonged. And I realized that maybe he did belong there. Maybe I had been wrong to think that the love I'd given him, the life I'd provided, had been enough. Maybe Jessica's family really could offer him things I never could. Not just money and connections, but a version of himself that didn't carry the weight of our struggles. Maybe I had been selfish to want to remain part of his story when clearly he was happier writing a new one without me. That thought should have brought me peace. But instead, it brought something darker. A resignation that felt like drowning. I stopped calling Michael altogether. I stopped checking his social media. I stopped mentioning him at work when customers asked about my family. When Mrs. Henderson asked about him in January, I just said, "He's doing very well, thank you for asking," and changed the subject. February brought my 56th birthday. In previous years, Michael had always called, sometimes sent flowers, once even surprised me with dinner at a restaurant I'd mentioned wanting to try. This year, nothing. Not a call, not a text, not even a Facebook message. I sat in my apartment that evening, looking at the birthday card I'd received from my neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, the only acknowledgement of the day that marked another year of my existence. Mrs. Rodriguez was 92 and had outlived most of her family, but she still remembered my birthday. My own son had forgotten I existed. That night I did something I hadn't done since Michael was a small child afraid of thunderstorms. I cried myself to sleep. Not the angry tears of betrayal or the frustrated tears of exclusion, but the deep, soul-crushing tears of someone who has finally accepted that they are no longer wanted. 3 weeks later, my world shifted again when I received an unexpected phone call from someone I hadn't heard from in years. "Sylvia, this is David Chen, Michael's friend from college. I hope you remember me." David. Of course I remembered him. He'd been Michael's roommate junior year, had come home with us for Thanksgiving when his own family was overseas. A sweet boy who'd always been polite to me, who'd helped Michael study for his economics exams. "David, of course. How are you? It's been so long." "I'm good, thanks. Listen, I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I wanted to reach out to you. I saw Michael at a professional networking event last month, and when I asked about you, he seemed uncomfortable. He said you were doing your own thing now." Doing my own thing. As if I had chosen this isolation. As if I had decided to live without my son rather than being systematically excluded from his life. "I see," I said carefully. "The thing is, Sylvia, Michael talked about you constantly in college. How hard you worked, how much you sacrificed for him, how proud he was to be your son. He used to say you were the strongest person he knew. So when he seemed almost embarrassed to talk about you, well, it didn't sit right with me." David's words hit me like physical blows. Michael had been proud of me once. He had talked about my strength, my sacrifices. When had that pride turned to shame? When had I become someone he needed to distance himself from? "I don't really know what's happening between you two," David continued. "But I wanted you to know that some of us remember how much you meant to him. And maybe he's just lost his way a little bit." After we hung up, I sat staring at the phone for a long time. David's call had awakened something in me that I'd been trying to bury. Hope. The dangerous, foolish hope that maybe this estrangement wasn't permanent. That maybe the son I'd raised was still somewhere inside the man who could barely acknowledge my existence. But hope was dangerous. Hope kept you trying when you should let go. Hope made you believe that love was enough when experience had proven it wasn't. I walked to my bedroom closet and pulled out a box I'd been avoiding for months. Inside were photos from Michael's childhood, report cards I'd saved, Mother's Day cards he'd made in elementary school with construction paper and glue. At the bottom of the box was a letter he'd written to me when he graduated from college. "Dear Mom," it began, "I know I don't say this enough, but everything I've accomplished is because of you. You gave up everything to give me everything. You worked when you were exhausted, sacrificed when you had nothing left to sacrifice, believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. I promise I will spend the rest of my life making you proud and making sure you know how grateful I am for everything you've done." I read that letter 3 times, my tears making the ink blur slightly. This was the son I'd raised. This was the man who had once understood exactly what my love had cost me and what it had made possible for him. Somewhere along the way, that understanding had been replaced by embarrassment. That gratitude had been traded for social acceptance. That love had been deemed insufficient for the life he wanted to live. I put the letter back in the box and closed it gently. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something other than sadness or anger or desperate hope. I felt a quiet determination. I had spent months trying to understand how I had failed as a mother, how I had become someone my son needed to escape from. I had questioned every choice I'd made, every sacrifice I'd offered, every moment of love I'd given freely. But sitting there in my small apartment, holding evidence of the man I'd raised and the promises he'd made, I realized something important. I hadn't failed as a mother. I hadn't done anything wrong. I had loved my son completely, supported his dreams unconditionally, and given him every opportunity to become the successful man he was today. What had happened wasn't my failure. It was his choice. And choices, I was beginning to understand, always have consequences. I still had something left. Something they had forgotten about. Something they hadn't calculated into their perfect new life. I had 32 years of memories, sacrifices, and love that couldn't be erased by social climbing or embarrassment, or the desire to fit into a world that demanded I be forgotten. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to remind them of exactly what they had chosen to throw away. The weeks following David's call brought a strange kind of clarity. I stopped waiting for my phone to ring. I stopped checking social media for glimpses into a life I was no longer part of. Instead, I began to really observe the world around me with eyes that had been opened by loss. At the diner, I watched other families. I saw teenagers rolling their eyes at their mother's questions, but still sitting at the same table, still sharing meals together. I saw adult children bringing their parents to dinner, including them in conversations, introducing them to grandchildren with obvious pride. I saw what normal family relationships looked like when they weren't complicated by shame and social climbing. Mrs. Henderson became a regular source of comfort during this time. She had a way of appearing at my station whenever I looked particularly lost in thought, ordering coffee and pie and somehow knowing exactly when I needed someone to talk to. "You know," she said one afternoon in March, settling into her usual booth, "I've been coming to this diner for 8 years. I've watched you serve every customer with kindness, work extra shifts when people called in sick, never complain even when folks were rude to you." I poured her coffee, grateful for her steady presence. "It's just my job, Mrs. Henderson." "No, honey. Being polite is your job. Being kind is a choice. And you've chosen kindness every single day, even when life hasn't been particularly kind to you." She stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "That says something important about who you are." Her words stayed with me as I went about my daily routine. I began to see myself through different eyes. Not as the embarrassment Michael and Jessica saw, but as the woman Mrs. Henderson described. A woman who had worked hard, loved deeply, and maintained her dignity even when others tried to strip it away. I started paying attention to conversations around me, really listening to how people talked about their families, their struggles, their victories. And I realized something that had been hidden by my pain. Most people respected the kind of sacrifices I'd made. Most people understood that raising a child alone while working multiple jobs wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was something to be proud of. The problem wasn't that I was embarrassing. The problem was that Michael had surrounded himself with people who valued appearance over substance, money over character, social status over genuine accomplishment. In April, I made a decision that surprised even me. I enrolled in a community college course called Small Business Management. Not because I had any particular business aspirations, but because I wanted to learn something new. I wanted to invest in myself the way I'd invested in Michael for so many years. The class met Tuesday evenings, and for the first time in months, I had something to look forward to that didn't involve waiting for someone else to include me in their plans. My instructor, Professor Williams, was a woman about my age who had started her own consulting firm after her divorce. She spoke about business principles with the authority of someone who had built something meaningful from nothing, and she treated every student like their questions and goals mattered. "Success," she said during our third class, "isn't about where you start. It's about what you build with what you have." Some of the most successful entrepreneurs I know started with nothing but determination and the willingness to work harder than anyone else thought was necessary. I thought about Michael, how his current success was built entirely on foundations I had provided, The education I'd funded, the work ethic I'd modeled, the confidence I'd nurtured through years of encouragement and support. His humble beginnings weren't something to be ashamed of. They were proof of what could be accomplished through love, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment. Jessica's family hadn't built Michael's character. They hadn't taught him to work hard or dream big or persist through difficulties. They had simply provided the final piece, the social connections and financial cushion that allowed him to capitalize on everything I had already given him. But somehow, in their version of his story, they were the heroes, and I was the embarrassing prologue that needed to be forgotten. One evening after class, as I walked to my car, I found myself thinking about a conversation I'd overheard at the diner that morning. Two women had been discussing their adult children, and one had said something that struck me. The way your kids treat you as an adult is the real measure of how well you raised them. I had raised Michael to be ambitious, but also to be grateful. I had taught him to work hard, but also to remember where he came from. I had encouraged him to reach for better opportunities, but also to value the people who helped him along the way. If he had forgotten those lessons, if he had chosen to embrace values that required him to deny my existence, then perhaps the problem wasn't with the way I had raised him. Perhaps the problem was with the person he had chosen to become. This realization brought me something I hadn't expected: peace. Not happiness. I was still deeply hurt by his rejection, but peace in knowing that I had done my job as a mother well, and that his current behavior said more about his character than it did about mine. In May, I received an unexpected piece of news that would change everything. I was working the morning shift when my phone buzzed with a text from David Chen. "Sylvia, I hope this isn't overstepping, but I thought you should know. There are some rumors going around about Jessica's family business, some financial irregularities. I don't know if Michael knows yet, but people in our industry are talking." I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me wanted to immediately call Michael, to warn him, to protect him the way I always had. But another part of me, a part that had been growing stronger since David's first call, held back. Michael had made it clear that he didn't want my involvement in his life. He had chosen to trust Jessica's family completely while dismissing the woman who had never let him down. If something was wrong with their business, if his new life was built on unstable foundations, then perhaps he needed to discover that without my interference. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I looked up Jessica's father's business online. What I found made my blood run cold. Robert White's car dealerships were indeed successful, but a deeper search revealed concerning patterns: customer complaints about predatory lending practices, former employees alleging pressure to falsify loan applications, a pattern of targeting vulnerable customers with bad credit, trapping them in high-interest loans they couldn't afford. The more I read, the sicker I felt. This was the family that Michael had chosen over me. These were the people whose standards I apparently didn't meet. A family that built their wealth by taking advantage of people exactly like I had been when Michael was young. Working-class people with limited options and big dreams for their children. I printed out everything I found and put it in a folder. Not because I planned to use it, but because I wanted to understand exactly what kind of people had replaced me in my son's life. 3 days later, the local newspaper ran a front-page story about an investigation into White Auto Group. The headline read, "Local dealership chain under investigation for predatory lending practices." My phone rang that evening. For the first time in 6 months, Michael's name appeared on my screen. "Mom," he said, his voice shaky. "I don't know if you've seen the news, but I saw it," I said quietly. "Jessica's dad says it's all a misunderstanding, that disgruntled employees are making up stories. But Mom, if this is true, if I've been working for people who hurt families like ours used to be. Finally, an acknowledgement of what we had been, what I had struggled through to give him opportunities. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I don't know. Jessica says I should stand by the family. That loyalty means supporting them through difficult times. But I keep thinking about what you used to say when I was little, that a person's character is shown by how they treat people who can't fight back." My throat tightened. He did remember. Somewhere underneath the expensive clothes and the polished accent and the carefully constructed new identity My son was still there. What does your conscience tell you, Michael? There was a long pause. That I might have made a terrible mistake. Not just about the job, Mom. About a lot of things. I closed my eyes, feeling 32 years of love surge through my chest. The boy I had raised was still in there, struggling against the man he had tried to become. Michael, I said gently, your conscience has never steered you wrong. Trust it now. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment and realized that everything was about to change. The perfect life Michael had built, the family that had replaced me, the social circle that had excluded me, all of it was about to crumble. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I held the power to decide what happened next. I could let him fall. I could let him learn the hard way what it meant to choose status over substance, social climbing over loyalty, embarrassment over love. Or I could do what mothers do. I could catch him when he fell, even though he had pushed me away. I could show him what real family loyalty looked like, even though he had forgotten. The choice was mine now. And unlike Michael, I had 32 years of practice in choosing love over pride, sacrifice over self-protection, forgiveness over revenge. I had something they had forgotten about. I had something that couldn't be bought or socially maneuvered or wished away. I had the unshakable foundation of a mother's love. And sometimes, that foundation is the only thing strong enough to rebuild a life that has been constructed on lies. The next morning brought chaos in ways I could never have anticipated. My phone rang at 6 a.m., Michael again. But this time, his voice carried a panic I hadn't heard since he was a child afraid of the dark. Mom, I need your advice. The FBI showed up at the dealership yesterday afternoon. They're seizing financial records, computers, everything. Jessica's father has been arrested. I sat up in bed, instantly alert. Arrested for what? Fraud. Money laundering. The investigation has been going on for months, apparently. They have evidence that the dealership was knowingly writing illegal loans, targeting elderly people and single mothers with bad credit. Mom, they were stealing from families just like we were. Just like we were. Another acknowledgement of our shared past, our struggles, the life he'd been so eager to distance himself from. Where's Jessica? I asked. She's furious. Not at her father, at me. She says I should have known this was coming, that I should have been more helpful in covering things up. She wants me to lie to the investigators, to say I never saw anything suspicious. My chest tightened. And what do you think about that? I think she doesn't know who I am. I think she never knew who I am. His voice cracked slightly. Mom, I think I've been pretending to be someone else for so long that I almost forgot who I really was. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar pull of maternal instinct. Every fiber of my being wanted to rush to his side, to comfort him, to help him navigate this crisis the way I'd helped him through every difficulty in his childhood. But something held me back. A voice that sounded suspiciously like Professor Williams reminding me that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is let them face the consequences of their choices. What are you going to do? I asked. I don't know. If I tell the truth about what I've seen at the company, I could face charges too. But if I lie, he paused. I keep hearing your voice, Mom. All those times you told me that integrity wasn't negotiable, that I should never compromise my values for money or status or anyone's approval. Those conversations felt like a lifetime ago, back when he still listened to my advice, still valued my opinion, still saw me as someone worth learning from. I told the investigators I'd come in tomorrow to give a statement. He continued. Jessica says if I cooperate with them, she'll leave me. Her mother called me a traitor. Her whole family is acting like I owe them my silence, like loyalty means being complicit in fraud. And what do you think loyalty means? I asked quietly. There was a long pause. I used to think it meant standing by people no matter what they did. But that's not what you taught me, is it? You taught me that real loyalty means being loyal to what's right, even when it's difficult. My throat tightened with emotion. Somewhere in the man who had spent months treating me like an embarrassment, my son was still there. The boy I'd raised to have a moral compass, to understand the difference between right and wrong, to stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. 2 hours later, my phone rang again. This time it was Jessica. "Sylvia," she said, her voice cold and sharp. "I think we need to talk." I had never heard Jessica use my first name before. In the few interactions we'd had, she'd avoided calling me anything at all. Certainly not Mom or Mrs. Patterson. The use of my name felt deliberately disrespectful, a way of putting me in my place. "About what, Jessica?" "About your son's sudden attack of conscience. Someone needs to talk sense into him before he destroys our entire family. Our family. Not his family or her family, but their family. The family I had been systematically excluded from until the moment they needed something from me." "I see," I said carefully. "And you think I have influence over Michael's decisions?" "Don't play games with me," Jessica snapped. "He's been calling you every day since this started. You're filling his head with ideas about honesty and integrity and all that sanctimonious garbage you raised him with." Sanctimonious garbage. The values I'd spent 32 years instilling in my son, honesty, integrity, standing up for what's right, were sanctimonious garbage to the woman he'd chosen to spend his life with. "I think Michael is capable of making his own moral decisions," I said. "Moral decisions?" Jessica's laugh was bitter. "Do you have any idea what's at stake here? If Michael testifies against my father, our entire life falls apart. His job, our apartment, our social circle, everything we've built together. And for what? To protect some deadbeat customers who were too stupid to read their loan contracts? Those deadbeat customers. People like I had been. People who worked multiple jobs and stretched every dollar and sometimes had to make desperate financial decisions because they loved their families and wanted to give them opportunities for something better." "Jessica," I said, keeping my voice steady, "are you asking me to convince my son to lie to federal investigators? I'm asking you to remind him where his loyalties should lie, with his wife and her family, not with strangers who don't matter." After she hung up, I sat staring at my phone for a long time. This was the woman Michael had chosen over me. Someone who saw victims of fraud as deadbeats who didn't matter. Someone who believed loyalty meant protecting criminals rather than standing up for what was right. Someone who was now asking me to convince my son to compromise his integrity to save her family's reputation. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in months. I drove to Michael's apartment building. I didn't call first. I didn't ask permission. I simply went to see my son, the way any mother would when her child was facing the biggest crisis of his life. The doorman recognized me from my one previous visit and let me up without question. When Michael opened the door, he looked like he'd aged years in the past week. His expensive clothes were wrinkled, his usually perfect hair was disheveled, and his eyes held the kind of exhaustion that comes from sleepless nights and impossible choices. "Mom," he said, and for the first time in over a year, he sounded genuinely glad to see me. "I brought soup," I said, holding up a container. "And before you say anything, I don't care how fancy your kitchen is. Sometimes you need your mother's soup." He let me in, and I was struck by how different the apartment felt. The perfection I'd noticed during my first visit was gone, replaced by the chaos of a life falling apart. Newspapers were scattered across the coffee table, all featuring headlines about the White Auto Group investigation. Jessica's belongings were notably absent from the common areas. "She's staying at her mother's," Michael explained, following my gaze. "Says she can't bear to look at me until I come to my senses." I heated the soup in his expensive kitchen while he sat at the counter, looking more like the uncertain young man I'd raised than the polished professional he'd become. "Tell me what you're thinking," I said, setting a bowl in front of him. "I'm thinking I've been an idiot," he said quietly. "I'm thinking I traded away the most important relationship in my life for people who only cared about me as long as I was useful to them." He took a spoonful of soup, and I saw his eyes close briefly. "I haven't had this in 2 years," he said. "Jessica doesn't like homemade food. Says it's unsophisticated." Unsophisticated. Like everything else about the life I'd given him. "Mom," he continued, "I need to tell you something. About the wedding, about everything. Jessica's mother planned the whole thing specifically to exclude you. She said having a single mother who worked in a diner would send the wrong message about what kind of family I came from." The words hit me like physical blows, but I kept my expression steady. "And you agreed with that?" I told myself it was easier. that I was protecting you from people who wouldn't appreciate you. He looked up at me with eyes full of regret. But I was really protecting myself. I was ashamed, Mom. Not of you, but of how hard our life had been. And instead of being proud of what we'd overcome together, I let them convince me it was something to hide. And now? I asked. Now I realize that the people who taught me to be ashamed of my mother are the same people who are asking me to lie to protect criminals. Now I understand that the values they rejected, honesty, integrity, loyalty to what's right, those aren't weaknesses. They're the foundation of everything good I've ever accomplished. I reached across the counter and took his hand. So, what are you going to do? I'm going to tell the truth tomorrow. All of it. About the illegal loans, about the pressure to target vulnerable customers, about everything I've seen at that company. He squeezed my hand. And I'm going to start rebuilding my life on a foundation that won't crumble the moment someone questions my integrity. That's going to be difficult, I warned. Jessica might leave. Her family will certainly turn against you. You might lose your job, your apartment, your social circle. I know, he said. But Mom, I've already lost the most important thing. I lost you, and I lost myself. At least if I do the right thing now, maybe I can start to earn both back. That evening, as I drove home through the city streets, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year. Hope. Not the desperate, clinging hope of someone waiting to be rescued, but the quiet confidence of someone who had weathered a storm and emerged stronger. Tomorrow would bring consequences. Michael would face federal investigators and tell them everything he knew. Jessica would probably leave him. Her family would certainly destroy his career in their industry. But tonight, for the first time in months, I was going to sleep knowing that the son I had raised, the one who understood right from wrong, who stood up for people who couldn't fight back, who valued integrity over appearance, was still there. And sometimes, that knowledge is enough to rebuild everything else. The next morning, I woke up knowing that everything was about to change forever. Michael was scheduled to meet with federal investigators at 10 a.m., and I found myself checking my phone every few minutes, wondering how it was going, hoping he would find the strength to do what he knew was right. At 11:30, my phone rang, but it wasn't Michael. Sylvia, this is Robert White. The voice was cold, controlled, and filled with the kind of authority that men like him wielded like weapons. I believe we need to have a conversation. Jessica's father, the man currently under federal investigation for fraud, calling me from what I could only assume was his lawyer's office. I don't think we have anything to discuss, Mr. White. Oh, but we do, he said, his tone suggesting that disagreeing with him was a luxury I couldn't afford. Your son is at the federal building right now, making statements that could destroy my family's business, my daughter's future, and his own career prospects. I think you might want to reconsider your influence over his decisions. I don't have any influence over Michael's decisions, I said. He's an adult who can think for himself. Is he? Robert White's laugh was sharp and unpleasant. Because from where I sit, it looks like a bitter single mother is using her son's momentary crisis of conscience to get revenge on a family that excluded her from their social circle. The accusation hit me like a physical blow, not because it was true, but because it revealed exactly how these people saw me. Not as a loving mother concerned about her son's integrity, but as a vindictive woman motivated by petty jealousy. Mr. White, I said, keeping my voice steady, your son-in-law is telling the truth about your business practices. That has nothing to do with me, doesn't it? His voice dropped to a more menacing tone. Because I've done some research on you, Sylvia. Single mother, works at a diner, no college education, no significant assets. A woman like you could benefit greatly from having a son with connections to successful people. Unless, of course, she poisoned that relationship out of spite. What exactly are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that your son's career in finance is over if he continues down this path. Not just with my company, but anywhere. Word travels fast in our industry, and a man who betrays his family's trust isn't someone anyone wants to employ. He paused for effect. But I'm also suggesting that certain arrangements could be made if you were to help him see reason. Arrangements? A position for you. Something better than serving coffee to truckers. Perhaps administrative work at one of my dealerships. Good pay, benefits, respect. All you have to do is call your son and remind him that loyalty to family should come before cooperation with government investigators. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what I was hearing. This man, this criminal, was attempting to bribe me to convince my son to lie to federal agents. He was offering me money and a job in exchange for helping him cover up crimes against vulnerable families. Families exactly like mine had been when Michael was young. Mr. White, I said slowly, are you offering me money to convince my son to obstruct a federal investigation? I'm offering you an opportunity to help your family, Sylvia. Think carefully about what's best for everyone involved. The call ended, and I sat staring at my phone in disbelief. In the span of 2 weeks, I had learned that the family my son had chosen over me was not only built on criminal enterprises, but they were now actively trying to involve me in their corruption. An hour later, as I was still trying to process Robert White's call, my phone rang again. This time it was Martha. Sylvia, I just heard about the White family troubles, she said, her voice carrying false sympathy. Such a terrible situation for poor Michael and Jessica. It is, I agreed carefully. I hope you're not encouraging Michael to make things worse by cooperating with these investigators. Sometimes family loyalty means protecting each other, even when it's difficult. Family loyalty, the same phrase Jessica had used, the same concept Robert White had tried to invoke. Apparently, the entire network of people who had excluded me from Michael's life now expected me to help them pressure him into committing federal crimes. Martha, I said, what do you think family loyalty means? Well, it means standing by your family when they're under attack. It means not airing dirty laundry in public. It means understanding that sometimes the greater good requires small sacrifices of principle. Small sacrifices of principle, like convincing my son to lie to federal investigators, like covering up crimes against working families, like protecting wealthy criminals at the expense of their victims. I see, I said. And you think I should convince Michael to sacrifice his principles? I think you should convince Michael to be smart about his future. Jessica is a wonderful girl from a good family, and if he throws that away for some misguided sense of moral superiority, he'll regret it for the rest of his life. After Martha hung up, I sat in my small apartment and realized something that both terrified and liberated me. Every single person who had judged me as unworthy of inclusion in Michael's new life was now counting on me to save that life by compromising my son's integrity. They had spent months treating me like I was beneath them, like my values were unsophisticated, like my influence on Michael was something to be overcome. But now, when their perfect world was crumbling, they all believed I had the power to fix it. They were right. I did have that power. At 2 o'clock, Michael called. Mom, I did it. I told them everything. His voice was exhausted but clear. About the predatory lending practices, about targeting vulnerable customers, about the pressure to falsify loan applications. All of it. How do you feel? I asked. Scared, he admitted, but also free. For the first time in 2 years, I feel like myself again. There's something you need to know, I said. Your father-in-law called me this morning. He offered me money to convince you to change your testimony. The silence on the other end of the line was so complete I thought the call had dropped. He what? Michael's voice was barely a whisper. He offered me a job, better pay, benefits. All I had to do was call you and remind you that family loyalty should come before cooperation with investigators. My God, Michael said. Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry you got dragged into this. I'm sorry they approached you. I'm sorry for everything. You don't need to apologize for their behavior, Michael. But I need you to understand something. Every person who convinced you that I wasn't good enough for your new life has now asked me to help them pressure you into committing federal crimes. The same people who said my values were unsophisticated are now counting on those values to save them. What did you tell him? I told him the truth, that you're an adult who can make his own moral decisions, that I don't have influence over your choices, and I wouldn't use it if I did. But you do have influence over me, Mom. You have more influence than anyone else in my life. You always have. Then let me use it now, I said. Michael, I am proud of you for telling the truth today. I am proud that when it mattered most, you remembered the values I tried to teach you. I am proud that you chose integrity over comfort, honesty over self-preservation. I heard him crying softly on the other end of the line. I am proud to be your mother, I continued, and I will be proud to stand by you through whatever consequences come from doing the right thing. That evening, the local news ran a story about Michael's testimony. The reporter described him as a key witness, whose cooperation had provided investigators with crucial evidence about the White Auto Group's criminal activities. At 8 o'clock, Jessica called. I hope you're satisfied, she said, her voice filled with venom. You've destroyed everything we built together. Jessica, I said calmly, your family destroyed itself by committing crimes. Michael simply chose not to be complicit in covering them up. He chose you over me, she spat. After everything my family did for him, after all the opportunities we provided, he threw it all away because his mommy told him to be honest. No, I said firmly. He chose right over wrong. He chose integrity over corruption. He chose to be the man I raised him to be instead of the man you wanted him to become. A man with no future, no prospects, no connections. Congratulations, Sylvia. You got your son back, but you've ruined his life. Jessica, I said, my voice steady and clear. I raised a son who understands that some things are more important than money and social status. If you can't see the value in that, then you never deserved him in the first place. The call ended, and I realized that for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt completely at peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Michael would face the consequences of his decision: financial hardship, social ostracism, professional difficulties. But he would face them as himself, not as someone pretending to be someone else. And he wouldn't face them alone, because the foundation we had built together, 32 years of love, sacrifice, and shared values, hadn't crumbled under pressure. It had proven strong enough to withstand the weight of crisis and emerge even stronger. The day everything changed had finally arrived. But it hadn't changed the way I'd feared it would. It had changed exactly the way it needed to. 6 months later, I stood in my new apartment. Nothing fancy, but bright and clean, with windows that faced east so I could watch the sunrise every morning. Michael was in the kitchen, making breakfast while I read the newspaper at my small dining table. This had become our Sunday routine, one of many new traditions we'd built together as we learned how to be a family again. The newspaper featured a follow-up story about the White Auto Group case. Robert White had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. 2 of his business partners had received similar sentences. The dealerships had been sold to pay restitution to the hundreds of families they had defrauded over the years. Did you see this? I asked, holding up the paper. Michael glanced over from where he was flipping pancakes. Yeah, I saw it online yesterday. They estimate the total amount stolen was over $12 million. $12 million. Taken from families like ours had been, people working multiple jobs, stretching every dollar, making desperate financial decisions because they loved their children and wanted better for them. Any regrets? I asked, though I already knew the answer. About testifying? None. He brought over a plate of pancakes and sat across from me. About everything else? Every day. The everything else was substantial. Jessica had filed for divorce within a week of his testimony, citing irreconcilable differences and demanding that he cover her legal fees. Her family had successfully destroyed his reputation in their industry. No financial firm would hire him, and his professional network had evaporated overnight. But Michael had found something better than the job he'd lost. He now worked for a nonprofit legal aid organization, helping working families navigate exactly the kind of predatory lending practices he'd once been complicit in enabling. The pay was less than half what he'd earned at the dealership, but he came home every evening looking like himself again. Mrs. Henderson asked about you yesterday, I told him. She said you looked happier than she'd ever seen you. Mrs. Henderson notices everything, he said, smiling. Did you tell her about the promotion? I had been promoted to assistant manager at the diner, a recognition of the leadership skills I'd apparently been demonstrating for years without realizing it. Professor Williams had recommended me for the position after I'd completed not just the small business management course, but 2 additional classes in accounting and human resources. I told her you were proud of your old mom for going back to school at 56. I am proud of you, Michael said seriously. For going back to school, for rebuilding your life, for forgiving me when I didn't deserve it. The forgiveness had been the hardest part. Not because I didn't love him. I had never stopped loving him. But because true forgiveness required both of us to be honest about what had happened and why. Michael had spent months in therapy, working through the shame and insecurity that had made him so susceptible to Jessica's family's manipulation. He'd had to confront the painful truth that he'd traded away his integrity and his most important relationship for the illusion of belonging to something more prestigious than what he'd come from. I'd had to confront my own role in the dynamic, how my willingness to sacrifice everything for his success had sometimes enabled him to take my love for granted, how my own insecurities about our financial circumstances had made me complicit in the idea that we needed to be something other than what we were. I've been thinking about something, Michael said, cutting into his pancakes. About what we talked about in therapy last week. We'd been going to family counseling together. Something I'd suggested after realizing that rebuilding our relationship would require more than just good intentions. Dr. Martinez had helped us understand how the patterns established in Michael's childhood, my sacrifices, his achievements, our shared struggle, had created a dynamic where love was demonstrated through giving and receiving rather than simply being. What about it? About how I always felt like I had to earn your love by succeeding, by making you proud, by becoming something worthy of all your sacrifices. He set down his fork and looked at me directly, and how that made it easier for Jessica's family to convince me that I needed to become someone completely different to be worthy of love at all. And what do you think now? I think I spent so many years trying to become worthy of love that I forgot I was already loved. That your love was never conditional on my achievements or my social status, or how impressive I could make myself appear to other people. This was the conversation we'd been building toward for months. The recognition that our relationship had been damaged not just by his rejection of me, but by dynamics that had made that rejection possible in the first place. I think, he continued, that I need to learn how to accept love without feeling like I have to earn it. And maybe you need to learn how to give love without sacrificing yourself for it. He was right. For 32 years, I'd defined my worth as a mother by how much I was willing to give up for Michael's benefit. His success had become my success, his happiness my responsibility, his approval my validation. When he'd rejected me, it had felt like a rejection of everything I was. But now, sitting in my own apartment, with my own accomplishments and my own future to look forward to, I understood something crucial. I had value that existed independently of my role as Michael's mother. I was Sylvia Patterson, a woman who had worked hard, learned new skills, maintained her integrity under pressure, and built meaningful relationships with people like Mrs. Henderson and Professor Williams. My worth wasn't determined by whether my son included me in his life. It was determined by how I chose to live my life, with or without his approval. I love you, Michael, I said. Not because of what you've accomplished or what you might accomplish in the future. I love you because you're my son, and because even when you lost your way, the person I raised was still in there, waiting to remember who he really was. I love you too, Mom, for who you are, not for what you've given me. Although, he smiled, I'm pretty grateful for those pancake-making skills you taught me. After breakfast, we walked to the farmer's market together, something we'd never done when he was growing up because we couldn't afford the premium prices. Now we could afford small luxuries, fresh vegetables, local honey, artisanal bread, not because either of us was wealthy, but because we'd learned to appreciate simple pleasures rather than constantly reaching for something more impressive. At the market, we ran into David Chen, who had become a regular part of our lives again. He'd helped Michael find his job at the legal aid organization and had become proof that some friendships could survive even dramatic changes in circumstances. How are my favorite mother-son team? David asked, buying us coffee from a local vendor. Thriving, Michael said, and I could see that he meant it. Any word from Jessica? David asked carefully. The divorce was finalized last month, Michael replied without visible emotion. She's engaged to someone her father's former business partner recommended, another rising star in the financial industry. I felt a momentary pang of sympathy for Jessica's new fiancé. He had no idea what he was signing up for, what would be expected of him, what he would be required to sacrifice to maintain his place in her family's carefully constructed social hierarchy. Her loss, David said firmly. No, Michael corrected. It was the right ending for both of us. Jessica deserves someone who wants the life she wants, and I deserve someone who loves the person I actually am. On the walk home, I reflected on how much had changed in just 6 months. The investigation and trial had been difficult, but they'd also been liberating. Michael's testimony had helped convict people who had stolen millions from vulnerable families. Our relationship had been rebuilt on a foundation of honesty rather than obligation. Most importantly, I'd learned something I should have understood years earlier. Love doesn't require you to diminish yourself to lift someone else up. Real love, the kind that lasts, the kind that sustains, the kind that survives crisis and change, creates space for both people to be their authentic selves. Mom, Michael said as we climbed the stairs to my apartment, I know I've said this before, but I need to say it again. I'm sorry for making you feel like you weren't enough. You were always enough. You were always more than enough. I know, I said, and for the first time, I really did know. But Michael, I need you to understand something too. You don't have to spend the rest of your life making up for the mistakes you made when you were lost. You've found your way back. That's what matters now. That evening, I sat in my favorite chair by the window, watching the sun set over the city. My phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Henderson. Saw you and Michael at the market today. You both looked so happy. It does my heart good to see family love that's built to last. Built to last. I smiled, thinking about the foundation Michael and I had constructed together. Not perfect, but strong enough to survive the storm that had nearly destroyed us. Strong enough to support whatever came next. I'd learned that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone you love is let them fall. Let them face the consequences of their choices. Let them find their own way back to who they really are. And sometimes the most important thing you can do for yourself is remember that your worth isn't determined by whether other people recognize it. The silence in my apartment felt different now than it had 18 months ago. Then, it had been the silence of abandonment, of isolation, of being forgotten by the person who mattered most. Now it was the silence of peace, of a woman who had weathered a storm and discovered she was strong enough to rebuild not just her relationship with her son, but her relationship with herself. I'd spent 32 years believing that love meant sacrifice, that being a good mother meant giving up everything for my child's benefit. But I'd learned something better. Love means creating space for each other to be authentic, to make mistakes, to grow, and to choose each other not out of obligation but out of genuine affection and respect. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the confidence that your love will survive their worst moments. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the understanding that your worth exists independently of anyone else's recognition of it. I had found something better than being needed. I had found the quiet strength of being genuinely loved and choosing to love in return, not from desperation or obligation, but from the abundance of a heart that had learned its own value. That, I realized, was what justice really looked like. Not revenge or vindication, but the restoration of truth, dignity, and love to their rightful places in my life, and it was more than enough.